Come on now, easy. That's it. You did it.
$45, now 50. 50, looking for 55, got 55, now 60. $60, going once, going twice.
Come on now, drink up. You'll be all right.
Here's the paperwork for the calf, ma'am.
You know, you just bought a burial.
The calf was born wrong, and everyone at the Dodd Creek sale barn knew it. The mother had rejected it within the first hour, which was the kind of rejection that cattlemen read as information rather than sentiment. The cow's instinct, having made a calculation that the people standing at the fence were also making, which was that the calf was not going to survive and that the energy required to change that outcome exceeded what the outcome was worth. It was a bull calf, shorthorn cross, born 3 weeks early, and it weighed 41 pounds when a healthy calf at term weighed twice that, and its front legs had the slight angular deviation at the fetlock that early birth sometimes produced, and that the men at the fence identified as a further reason to write it off. The auctioneer had not bothered to run it through the ring. He had put it in a pen at the back of the barn with 2 other animals nobody wanted and assigned it a price of $1 to cover his trouble, which was the price of something you were doing a buyer a favor by selling. Cecile Drummond was 34 years old and had been running her late father's cattle operation on the Dodd Creek bottomland for 2 years without assistance and without, as far as the county could observe, particular difficulty, which was the thing about Cecile Drummond that the county found difficult to categorize. She was not the kind of woman the county had language for, which was a woman running a cattle operation the way a cattleman ran one, with the same decision process and the same comfort with numbers and the same habit of standing at a fence and reading what was in front of her rather than what she had been told to expect. She was standing at the back pen fence when most people were at the ring, and she was looking at the calf. The calf was on its side. Its breathing was the shallow, rapid breathing of an animal in distress, which was a condition she had seen before in premature calves, and which she knew from experience had 2 possible trajectories depending on whether anyone intervened and how quickly. She had intervened before. She had the knowledge and the equipment and the particular stubbornness about premature animals that had started in her father's barn when she was 11 years old and had never resolved itself into the pragmatism that the county's cattlemen would have considered appropriate. She bought the calf for $1. The man who sold it to her said, without unkindness but without tact either, that she was buying a burial. She said she would keep that in mind. She put the calf in the bed of the wagon on a blanket she had brought for this purpose, which told someone paying attention that she had decided before she arrived at the sale barn, which was worth paying attention to, and drove home to the Dodd Creek bottomland in the late afternoon with the calf breathing shallowly in the wagon bed and the August sun going down over the creek timber in the way it went down when the season was at its peak, slow and committed, and with the specific quality of light that made the bottomland look like something from a painting regardless of what was actually happening in it. She worked on the calf through the night. This is the plain description of what she did, and it does not convey the specific labor of it. The colostrum substitute warmed to the correct temperature and administered by stomach tube every 2 hours. The leg wraps that corrected the fetlock angle without overcorrecting. The monitoring of the breathing rate and the body temperature and the hydration, all of it recorded in the notebook she kept in the barn for exactly this kind of situation, because the notebook was how she tracked what was working and what wasn't in real time rather than in retrospect. And real time was what premature calves required. If this story finds you somewhere you didn't expect it, leave your city in the comments. I want to know how far a thing carries when it starts with $1 and a night in a barn. By the 3rd day the calf was standing, not confidently and not for long, but standing, which was the first indication that the initial prognosis of everyone at the sale barn had been based on what the calf looked like at birth, rather than on what the calf was. By the end of the first week, it was nursing from a surrogate cow Cecile had identified in her own herd, a gentle animal who had lost her calf earlier in the season, and who accepted the small, angular newcomer with the careful attention of a cow whose instincts were looking for somewhere to go. She named the calf March, because he had arrived in August, and she had named calves after the month she expected them, and he had arrived 3 weeks early, and she had kept the expectation rather than the fact, which was a private joke she did not explain to anyone. March grew. He grew the way animals grow when they have been close enough to not surviving that the survival itself becomes a kind of energy, not dramatically, not faster than other calves, but with a consistency and a soundness that Cecile noted in the notebook every week for the first 6 months. The fetlock deviation corrected fully by October, which was earlier than she had projected from the literature she had read, and the one conversation she had with the large animal veterinarian in Millard, who had looked at her description and said he wouldn't have bothered. She noted his assessment and did not respond to it, and went home and continued doing what she was doing, which was working. The county noticed March in the way the county noticed most things on the Dodd Creek operation, which was through the fence, which was the position from which most of the county's assessment of Cecile Drummond had been conducted since she took over the operation 2 years ago. What they noticed in the fall was that the calf she had bought for $1 at the Dodd Creek sale barn, the one the auctioneer hadn't bothered to run through the ring, was not dead, which had been the consensus expectation. By November, it was not only not dead but visibly healthy. The angular early birth quality gone from its frame, its movement through the pasture easy and correct, its size approaching the lower range of normal for its age. The men who had been at the fence at the sale barn had varying responses to this information. The auctioneer said nothing because he was a professional. The man who had told Cecile she was buying a burial said nothing because he had already said it and it had turned out to be wrong, and there was nothing useful to add. The general county position shifted from the calf won't survive to the calf survived but it won't amount to anything, which was the position that required no revision of any prior assessment, and that was therefore the most comfortable position available. Cecile noted this position and continued working. She had a cattle operation to run. The calf was one animal. The operation was 312 animals on 800 acres of Dodd Creek bottomland, and it required her full attention every day, regardless of what the county thought about any individual animal within it. What the county did not see, because the county was watching from the fence and the fence was not inside the operation, was what Cecile had begun to notice about March in the spring of his first year, which was something she had no prior reference for, and which she spent the first 6 months of that spring trying to determine whether she was seeing accurately or projecting. She was seeing accurately. What she was seeing was this. March moved through the herd differently from the other animals, not in the way of a led animal, which was a different thing and recognizable by different signs, but in the way of an animal that had a quality in its presence that produced a specific response in the animals around it, a settling response, a reduction in the ambient anxiety that cattle herds carry as background noise, and that most cattlemen manage through handling technique rather than through any quality inherent in the animals themselves. March didn't do anything. He moved through the herd, and the herd settled. She watched this for 3 months before she wrote it in the notebook, because she did not write things in the notebook until she was certain she was seeing them, rather than imagining them. In April, she wrote, March producing a settling effect in the herd, not lead behavior, something else. Investigate. She investigated by watching. She watched for the rest of the spring and through the summer, and what she found confirmed what she had written in April, which was that the settling effect was consistent, and that it occurred not only in her own herd, but when her herd was moved adjacent to other cattle, which she observed twice at the shared fence line with the Aldridge operation to the east. She did not tell anyone what she was observing, partly because she did not yet have language for it, that would be received as anything other than the anthropomorphism that cattlemen found unprofessional, and partly because she wanted to understand it more completely before she said anything to anyone, and understanding it more completely required more observation, and more observation required time she was not going to rush. She went to the county library instead. The county library in Millard had a small agricultural section and a larger general collection, and a librarian named Phyllis Ogle, who had been running the library for 20 years, and who received book requests with the patient efficiency of someone who had learned that the books people asked for told her more about what they were actually trying to understand than the questions they were willing to ask out loud. Cecile asked for everything the library had on cattle temperament and herd behavior and the heritability of behavioral traits, which was a combination of requests that Phyllis assembled over 2 weeks from the library's own collection and from an interlibrary arrangement with a college agricultural library in the state capital. The books arrived, and Cecile read them the way she read everything relevant to the operation, completely and with a pencil. And what she found in the third book, an agricultural research text from a Pennsylvania college, was the closest thing to a description of what she was observing that she had encountered in any source. The text described a body of research on what it called temperament inheritance in cattle, the degree to which specific behavioral characteristics, calm disposition, low reactivity to novel stimuli, reduced flight response, were heritable in predictable ways and could be selected for over generations of breeding. The research was preliminary. The text was careful about what it claimed, but what it described in its careful, qualified language was the mechanism she had been watching in the South pasture since April, the transmission of a behavioral quality through the presence of an animal who possessed it in an unusually concentrated form. She read the relevant sections 3 times. She wrote in her notebook, "March's settling quality may be heritable. If heritable, selectable. If selectable, this is a breeding program." She looked at what she had written for a long time. Then she drew a line under it and turned to a new page and began writing what a breeding program would require, which was the most detailed planning she had done since taking over the operation, and which took 4 evenings to complete to a level she was willing to act on. What it required was a specific breeding strategy built around March as the founding sire, selected for the behavioral trait she had identified and documented, and a tracking system that would allow her to measure the trait's expression in offspring across multiple generations, and a timeline that was honest about the fact that breeding programs measured in cattle generations, which were 3 to 4 years per generation, and that she was planning something with a horizon of 10 years minimum before the results would be legible to anyone outside the operation. She had the operation, she had the bottomland and the herd and the notebook and the patience that came from having run an 800-acre cattle operation alone for 2 years without asking anyone whether it was something she should be doing. She had March. She began. The first breeding season was the second fall of March's life, when he had reached the size and condition for service, and when Cecile had selected the first group of cows based on criteria she had been developing since the spring, which were the criteria for animals that showed the highest baseline reactivity in the herd, the animals that startled most easily and moved most unpredictably and required the most handling time, because the highest reactivity animals were the ones in which an improvement in the trait would be most visible and most measurable. She put March with 12 cows in the south pasture in October and watched the pasture for 6 weeks and noted everything she observed in the notebook. And in February, when the pregnancies were confirmed, she noted the dam of each calf and the dates and the specific behavioral observations she had made about each dam in the 6 months before breeding, which was the baseline against which she would measure the calves when they arrived. The calves arrived in August. 9 survived to weaning. Cecile watched all 9 from birth and wrote what she saw in the notebook with the same specificity she had been bringing to March's observation for 2 years. What she saw in 7 of the 9 was a quality she had been looking for and that she identified carefully, watching for 3 months, before she named it even in the notebook, which was the same discipline she had applied to March and which produced the same result, which was a description she could defend. She wrote, 7 of 9 calves from March's first breeding season showing measurably reduced reactivity against dam baseline, 3 showing significant reduction. The trait is expressing. She wrote it and then went outside and looked at the south pasture where the 9 calves were moving through the afternoon light and thought about the sale barn and the back pen and the $1 and the auctioneer who hadn't bothered to run the animal through the ring, and she thought about what the county's working consensus was, which was still that Cecile Drummond was doing well enough with the operation her father had left her, but was perhaps not entirely practical in some of her decisions. And she thought about the 10-year horizon of the breeding program and what it would look like when it reached the other end. And she set all of that aside and went back inside and turned to a new page in the notebook and started on the second breeding season's selection criteria. The man who had told her she was buying a burial came past the Dodd Creek fence in March's second spring and stopped his wagon and looked at the bull, who was by then a sizable animal, with the kind of presence that even someone with no investment in his particular quality could see as significant. The man looked at March for a long time. He said, through the fence, to Cecile, who was working the water line at the trough, "That's the calf from Dodd Creek." She said, "That's him." He said, "He's a size." She said, "He is." He said, "What are you doing with him?" She said, "Breeding program." He said, "What kind of breeding program?" She said, "Temperament selection." He looked at March, and then at Cecile, and then at March again. He said, "Temperament." She said, "The trait is heritable and selectable. I'm selecting for it." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I don't know any operation that selects for temperament." She said, "I know." He drove on. She went back to the water line. She noted the conversation in the notebook as Holt at the fence, confirmed no comparable program in county. Good. The third year was the year the herd began to change in the way she had planned for, but that was still, when she saw it happening, something she had to stand still for and look at carefully to confirm she was seeing it and not projecting it. The south pasture animals, the March progeny and their dam group, were visibly different in their behavior from the north pasture animals, which were the balance of the herd she had not introduced to the breeding program, and the difference was not subtle. The south pasture moved as a unit when moved. The north pasture fragmented. The south pasture returned to grazing within minutes of a disruption. The north pasture took longer. The south pasture's handling time per animal was 30% below the north pasture's, a figure she had begun tracking in the second year because handling time was a cost, and cost was what the notebook was for. She wrote the 30% figure in the notebook in the third year and stared at it for a long time. She understood what it meant in purely operational terms, which was that the animals coming through the March breeding program were cheaper to handle, which meant the operation was more efficient per animal, which meant the margin per animal was higher even before you considered any premium on the animals themselves at sale. She had not yet sold any of the March progeny. She was not ready to sell them yet. She was building the herd. She needed the numbers before she needed the sales, because the numbers were the argument, and the argument was going to need to be very clear before she made it to anyone who hadn't been watching the south pasture for 3 years. The person she decided to show the numbers to first was a man named Devereaux, who ran the agricultural lending operation at the Millard Bank, and who had been managing the Dodd Creek operations account since before Cecile's father died, and who had therefore seen the account's trajectory under 2 operators and had the specific knowledge that came from that comparison, which was that the account under Cecile was performing better than the account under her father, which her father had been a competent operator, and that the difference was attributable to operational decisions he could see in the account and could not always explain from outside the operation. She came to see Devereaux in the third year's November, not to borrow but to show him the notebook pages she had prepared, which were a summary of the breeding program's results to date, the reactivity measurements and the handling time differential, and the dam and progeny records, and the heritability documentation from the Pennsylvania research she had been tracking since the second year. She set the pages on his desk and let him read. He read slowly, which was how he read everything, and asked 2 questions in the middle of reading and 3 more at the end. She answered all 5. He was quiet for a while. He said, "The handling time differential, 30%. She said, "Against the control group in the North Pasture. Same land, same management, same forage. The only variable is the sire." He said, "How many generations to reach full expression of the trait at herd scale?" She said, "The research suggests 3 to 4. I'm in generation 1. I'm planning a 10-year program." He said, 10 years. She said, "Cattle generations are long." He looked at the pages. He said, "Who else is doing this?" She said, "Nobody in this county." He said, "In the territory." She said, "I haven't found a comparable program in the literature." He looked at her. He said, "You have a bull with a heritable behavioral trait, a documented first generation showing expression, and a handling cost differential that's currently 30% and will increase as the program advances." She had nothing left. No husband, no harvest, no dignity. He said, "How do you make it recognized?" She said, "The handling time differential is visible to anyone who works the animals. I'll let buyers work them before they bid." He looked at the pages again. He said, "Come back in the spring. I want to see the second generation data before I say anything beyond what I've said." She came back in the spring with the second generation data, which was the progeny of the March daughters who had come into their first breeding season in the fall of the 3rd year, and which showed the trait expressing in the second generation at a level that was, against the baseline, statistically significant in the way that the Pennsylvania research had predicted for a trait with a strong heritability coefficient. She showed Devereaux the comparison between Generation 1 expression and Generation 2 expression, and the trajectory the data implied for Generations 3 and 4. He read it 3 times. He said, "The trajectory," she said, "is consistent with the research predictions." He said, "Which you've been following for 4 years." She said, "Reading and tracking simultaneously." He said, "Most operations don't work this way." She said, "Most operations don't have March." He almost smiled. He was not a man who smiled fully at his desk in a bank. He said, "What do you need?" She said, "I don't need anything right now. I'm showing you because you manage the account and you should understand what's in it." He looked at her. He said, "You're showing me because you want me to understand before you need me to act on it." She said, "I'm showing you because the data is real and I want someone besides me to have seen it." He said, "That's the same thing." She said, "Almost." He kept the pages she had brought him, which she had expected, and she went home and continued the program. The sale of the first March progeny happened in the 5th year, when she had 12 animals from the breeding program that had reached sale weight and condition and that she brought to the Dodd Creek sale barn for the spring auction, not to the back pen, but to the ring, in the regular order of business. She had spoken to the auctioneer beforehand, the same auctioneer who had put March in the back pen for $1 5 years ago, and who received Cecile's request for a pre-auction demonstration without visible irony, and she had arranged for the 12 animals to be worked in the handling facility before the sale so that buyers could observe them. The buyers who observed them saw something that most of them had not seen in a working cattle facility, which was 12 animals moving through the chutes and the sorting and the loading sequence with a calm and a cooperativeness that required half the handling time of the standard animals being run the same morning. The facility crew noticed before the buyers did, because the facility crew was the one doing the handling, and the reduced resistance was immediately legible in the physical work of it. One of the crew said, after the 12th animal was loaded, to no one in particular, "What is in those cattle?" The answer was March, and Cecile said so to the buyers who asked afterward, and she brought out the notebook summary she had prepared, 2 pages that described the breeding program and the heritability documentation and the handling time differential across 5 years, and she let the buyers read it. 3 of the buyers read it carefully. The other 2 asked questions that told her they were not yet ready for what the pages said, which was fine because she did not need all 5 buyers. She needed 3. The sale prices on the 12 animals were above the standard rate for comparable animals by a margin that was not enormous, but that was consistent. All 12 animals selling above the average for the morning. The 3 buyers who had read carefully, buying 4 animals each. She drove home with the sale figures and wrote them in the notebook, and beside them wrote, "First sale, premium confirmed." Buyers who read the data paid the premium. Buyers who didn't paid the average. She closed the notebook and sat at the kitchen table and thought about the back pen and the dollar and the 41-pound calf breathing shallowly on a blanket in the wagon bed, and the night in the barn with the stomach tube and the leg wraps and the notebook and everything that had followed from the specific decision not to write off an animal, because the conventional wisdom about it was that the outcome wasn't worth the effort. The conventional wisdom had been wrong, not maliciously and not stupidly, but wrong in the specific way that conventional wisdom is wrong when it has been calibrated against a large number of ordinary cases and has not accounted for the case that is not ordinary. March had not been an ordinary case. She had known that in the back pen at the sale barn before she had evidence for it, which was the part of the story she would never be fully able to explain to anyone who asked, because the part of the decision that preceded the evidence was not a calculation but a reading, the same kind of reading she had done at fence lines her whole life, the kind that came from looking at what was actually in front of you rather than at what you had been told to expect. She went out to the south pasture. March was at the far end of the field, moving through the evening light with the easy certainty of an animal that had been almost nothing and had become something, not through drama or against particular odds in any romantic sense, but through the specific mechanism of being what he was, in an environment that understood what he was, and had built accordingly. The south pasture herd moved around him in the settling way she had been watching for 5 years, and the evening was quiet over the Dodd Creek bottomland, in the way it was always quiet when the day's work was done and the next day's work hadn't started, and she stood at the fence and watched it and wrote nothing down, which was unusual for her, because she understood some things better by not writing them immediately, by letting them stay in the observation stage a little longer than was strictly necessary, and what she was observing was something she wanted to see clearly before she wrote it, which was the thing she had built from a dollar and a blanket and a night in the barn, standing in the south pasture in the evening light, looking exactly like what it was, which was the beginning of something that had not yet reached the end of what it would become. The 6th year was the year the county began to understand what was in the south pasture, not because Cecile told them, but because the 3 buyers from the 5th year sale came back with other buyers in tow, which was the natural movement of information in a cattle market, word traveling from a buyer who has seen something to a buyer who hasn't, in the specific direction of money, which is always toward the thing that costs less to manage. 2 of the 5 new buyers had driven from the next county. 1 had driven from 3 counties east, which was a distance that told her something specific about how far the word had traveled and what form it was traveling in. She ran the same pre-sale demonstration in year 6, the handling facility observation, and she brought the 2-page notebook summary she had updated to include the 5th year's data and the second-generation handling time differential, which had increased from 30% to 41% as the second-generation animals matured into the handling weights. 41% was a number that communicated itself without requiring explanation to anyone who had worked cattle, because 41% was not a marginal difference. It was a different category of work, the difference between a handling operation that wore people out and one that didn't. The buyer from 3 counties east said, after watching the demonstration, "I've worked cattle for 30 years. I've never seen a group move through a facility like that." Cecile said, "What you're seeing is the 3rd expression of a heritable trait. Generation 0 is in the south pasture. These are his grandchildren." The buyer looked at her. He said, "Generation 0. She said, "The founding sire. He's still in the south pasture." He said, "I'd like to see him." She showed him March. March was 7 years old and had the kind of presence that working cattle acquire when they have been well managed through their full development, solid and calm and indifferent to being observed in the way of animals that have never been given a reason to be otherwise. The buyer stood at the fence and looked at March for a long time. He said, "What was he when you bought him?" She said, 41 pounds and rejected by his mother. He turned and looked at her. She said, $1 at the Dodd Creek sale barn. The auctioneer didn't run him through the ring. He looked back at March. He said, "And the trait, you identified it how?" She said, "By watching him in the south pasture for 3 months before I wrote it down." He said, 3 months. She said, "I don't write things down until I'm certain I'm seeing them." He was quiet. He said, "How many progeny on the ground?" She told him the current count, which was 47 animals across 3 generations, all of them in the south pasture or the east field. None of them sold yet, except the 12 from the previous year. He said, "I'd like to buy 20. She said, "I can put you on the list for the fall sale. The demonstration will be the same as this morning." He said, "I don't need the demonstration again." She said, "The demonstration is for the benefit of the other buyers. It keeps the bidding honest." He looked at her. He said, "You've thought about this." She said, "I've been thinking about it for 6 years. He put his name on the list. The fall sale in year 6 produced the premium that Devereaux had anticipated when he read the data in the spring of year 4. Not a small premium, not the above average but within range that the year 5 sale had produced, but a significant premium, the kind that expressed a market's recognition of a category difference rather than a quality difference, which was the distinction she had been building toward since the first breeding season. The Dodd Creek sale barn had not seen prices like it on range cattle. The auctioneer, the same man who had put March in the back pen for $1, ran the year 6 animals through the ring with the professional enthusiasm of a man who understood what the bidding meant for his facility's reputation. And when the last animal was sold, he came to find Cecile at the back fence and said, without ceremony, "Those prices." She said, "Yes." He said, "The bull in the south pasture, the $1 animal." She said, "March." He said, "Those prices are what he produced." She said, "Over 6 years, yes." He looked at the ring, where the last of her animals had just loaded. He said, "I didn't run him through the ring." She said, "I know." He said, "I should have." She said, "You made the correct decision for the information you had." He looked at her. He said, "That's generous." She said, "It's accurate. You couldn't see what I saw." He said, "What did you see?" She said, "I saw an animal that was close to not surviving, which is different from an animal that is not going to survive." He thought about this. He said, "Most people don't see the difference." She said, "Most people are looking at the same animal from the same angle. I was looking for something different." He went back to the ring. She went back to the wagon. She drove home on the Dodd Creek Road in the October afternoon, with the sale figures in her coat pocket, and March in the south pasture ahead, and the 7th year's breeding selection already mapped in the notebook at home, and she thought about the county's working assessment of the operation, which had been shifting since year 5 when the first premium sale moved through the market's information network, and which by year 6 had arrived at something close to what it was, which was a cattle operation on the Dodd Creek bottomland that was doing something nobody else in the county or the counties around it had done, which was not a new kind of cattle, but a new understanding of what cattle could carry, that wasn't visible from the outside, that lived inside the animal, in the way that all the most valuable things live, which is quietly and heritably and available to anyone who looked carefully enough and was patient enough to wait for the looking to produce what it took years to produce. The 7th year brought the inquiry from outside the territory that she had been expecting since the 6th year's sale figures moved through the market. It came in the form of a letter from a man named Greer, who ran a cattle operation in Kansas. and who described himself as having heard about the Dodd Creek breeding program from two separate buyers, which was the way information traveled when it was accurate and financially significant, which was without needing to be pushed. The letter asked about the program's methodology, the heritability documentation, the current herd numbers, and whether she would consider a consultation arrangement with his operation. She read it at the kitchen table and wrote in the notebook, Year 7, Greer Letter, Kansas Inquiry. She set the pen down and thought about the shape of what she had built, which was not only the South Pasture herd and the sale premium and the breeding records, but the specific body of knowledge that the breeding program had produced. The 7 years of observation and documentation and the understanding of what the trait was and how it expressed and how to select for it, which was a thing she had built alone and that existed nowhere else, and that was, she understood from Greer's letter, worth something to people who had not yet built it and would pay for the time she had already spent. She wrote back to Greer in the careful, specific way she wrote all significant letters, which was after she had decided what she was willing to discuss and what she was not, and what a consultation arrangement would require and what it would cost. She had not previously thought about what the knowledge was worth to someone else. She spent 3 days thinking about it before she wrote, because the price she set would determine not just the Greer conversation, but every subsequent conversation of the same kind. And she intended to set it once, and correctly. She set it, and wrote the letter. Greer wrote back in 10 days. He accepted the rate and the terms, and asked when he could come to Dodd Creek to see the operation. She wrote back a date in the spring, which was when the calving season would give him the most complete picture of what the program was producing in real time. He came in April. She spent 3 days showing him the operation and the records and the herd and the handling demonstrations and the breeding selection criteria, all of it documented in the notebook series she had been building since the first night in the barn with March. He took notes throughout, which she had expected, and asked good questions throughout, which she had also expected because the letter had been the letter of someone who had thought carefully before writing. On the last afternoon, he sat at the kitchen table with the notebooks she had allowed him to read and looked at the 7 years of daily entries and said, "You've been running a research program." She said, "I've been running a cattle operation." He said, "With research methodology." She said, "I write things down and compare them to what I wrote before. That's not research methodology, that's running a cattle operation correctly." He said, "Most operations don't do it this way." She said, "I know." He looked at the notebooks. He said, "The first entry." She turned to the first notebook. The first entry was from the night she brought March home, August, the first year, the weight and condition, and the treatments administered, and the times and the temperatures and the observations on the breathing rate. He read it. He said, "You started the records that first night." She said, "I start the records the first night with any animal that's going to require management." He said, "What told you he would require management?" She said, "He was breathing, and he wasn't going to be without it." He set the notebook down. He said, "I've been running cattle for 23 years. I've never seen a program like this." She said, "Nobody has, because nobody built one." He said, "You built one from $1. She said, "From what the dollar bought." He said, "Which was what?" She said, "An animal who had a quality I hadn't seen before. The dollar was incidental." He looked at the notebook stacked on the table, 7 volumes, the first one worn along the spine from being carried in and out of the barn for 2 years. He said, "I'd like to talk about a longer arrangement than the consultation." She said, "I expected you would." She had the notebook open to the page she had been working on since February, which was the page where she had outlined what a longer arrangement with a second operation would look like, and what it would require, and what it would cost, and what it would produce for both parties. She turned it so he could read it. He read it. He said, "You prepared this before I came." She said, "I prepare for conversations I expect to happen." He said, "What else do you expect to happen?" She said, "I expect you to come back in the fall with someone else who wants the same conversation. I expect the someone else to be from further away than Kansas." He looked at her. She said, "The 6th year sale figures traveled. Greer letters travel. The next letter will come from further." He said, "What will you tell the next letter?" She said, "The same thing I'm telling you, at a rate that reflects the distance the information has traveled." He almost laughed. He said, "That's a pricing model." She said, "It's an observation. Information that travels further is worth more because it traveled further. Whatever carried it to whoever writes the next letter did work I didn't do." He thought about this. He said, "All right." He signed the longer arrangement that afternoon. She walked him to his horse and watched him ride toward the Dodd Creek Road, and then went back to the south pasture fence and stood there looking at the spring calving that was underway. The March progeny in their 3rd and 4th generations moving through the April afternoon with the quality she had first seen 7 years ago and had never fully stopped being moved by. The quality that was not dramatic and not decorative, but that expressed itself in the simple, daily way of things that are correct, which was by making everything around them easier and calmer and more possible than it would have been without them. March was at the far end of the pasture. He was 11 years old, and his years were on him in the solid, settled way of age in a well-managed animal, and he moved through the south pasture with the same quality he had always moved through it, the same quality she had identified in the notebook after 3 months of watching, and described in the careful language of someone who writes only what they are certain they are seeing, and which was, 7 years later, in the 3rd and 4th generations of his progeny, and in the first pages of a Kansas operation's new breeding records, and in the sale figures that had come out of the Dodd Creek Ring and traveled east to buyers who had driven 3 counties to see what they had heard about, still the same quality, and still the thing the whole operation was built on, the quality of a 41-pound animal that was close to not surviving, and that she had driven home in the back of a wagon on a blanket she had brought for the purpose, understanding, before she had evidence, that there was something there worth saving, and being right, and spending 7 years proving it, one notebook entry at a time. The 8th year brought 3 more letters, which was what she had told Greer to expect, and which arrived in the form she had expected, each one from a greater distance than the last. The furthest from a ranching operation in Colorado that had heard about the Dodd Creek program through a buyer who had heard about it from another buyer in a chain that she traced back in the letter's own account to a man who had been at the year 6 sale and had been talking about the handling demonstration ever since. She answered all 3 letters in the same week, in the same careful way, setting out what the arrangement involved and what it cost and what it produced, and she filed the responses in the notebook drawer beside the Greer correspondence and waited for the replies, which came in the order she expected, the closest first and the Colorado operation last, and all 3 accepted. She now had 4 operations running breeding programs seeded from the Dodd Creek herd, each of them in their 1st or 2nd year of the process, and each of them corresponding with her, through the quarterly letters she had established as the documentation exchange. The record of what each operation was observing, and how it compared to what she had observed in the same stages of her own program. The quarterly letters were something she had not planned when the first arrangement with Greer was signed, but which had developed naturally from the first exchange of records, because what Greer was finding in Kansas and what she was finding in the 8th year of the program were not the same, and the difference was information that was useful to both of them. She had started a separate notebook for the external operations reports, which she read every quarter and annotated in the same way she annotated everything she read, with a pencil and specific notes in the margin, and which she was building into a comparative record that no single operation could have produced alone. The comparative record was, she understood by the 8th year, the thing that would eventually be the argument, not the sale prices, and not the individual herd data, but the documentation of the trait, expressing consistently across multiple operations in multiple landscapes, which was the documentation that moved something from an anomaly to a principle. She was building the documentation. It would take as long as it took. She drove to Millard in the 8th year's spring to see Devereaux, which she did every spring now as a matter of practice, and she brought the updated notebook summary and the 4 external correspondence files and sat across from him at the bank desk while he read. He read longer than usual. When he finished, he set the pages down and was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was processing something that required more than his standard analytical frame. He said, "The Colorado operation," she said, "youngest of the 4, first calving season." He said, "Their early results are tracking with yours in year 2. She said, "Closely enough to be significant." He said, "Which means the trait is expressing in different landscapes and different management conditions." She said, "Which means it's the trait and not the environment." He looked at the pages. He said, "This is what the Pennsylvania research predicted." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you're documenting it across 4 operations over 8 years." She said, 7 years of my own data and the external operations' first and second year data." He said, "Which will become 7 and 8 and 9-year data as the external programs mature." She said, "Yes." He looked at her. He said, "Cecile." She waited. He said, "Do you understand what you're building?" She said, "I understand what I'm documenting." He said, "That's not the same answer." She said, "I know, but it's the accurate one. I'm documenting what I see. What it builds into is a different question." He set the pages on the desk and folded his hands and looked at her in the way he had been looking at her since she first came to his office 8 years ago as a new operator on her father's account, which was the look of a man who had been calibrating an estimate for a long time and kept finding it was insufficient. He said, "The program you're running, the documentation you've built, the external arrangements, at some point this becomes something that has a name beyond a cattle breeding program." She said, "I know." He said, "What name?" She thought about this for a moment. She said, "A body of knowledge." He said, "Which belongs to you." She said, "Which I built. Whether it belongs to me is a legal question I haven't resolved yet." He said, "You should resolve it." She said, "I know. That's partly why I'm here." He looked at the pages again. He said, "I know a lawyer in the Capitol who handles agricultural intellectual property. It's an uncommon practice area, but it exists." She wrote the name. She said, "I'll write to him this week." She wrote the letter that week, and the lawyer responded, and she went to the Capitol in July and spent 2 days explaining the program to a man who asked the right questions and who arrived by the end of the second day at a position that was more useful than what she had expected, which was a specific framework for protecting the documentation and the methodology as an original body of work, which was not a standard cattle transaction, and which required language that did not yet fully exist in the territory's legal practice, but that the lawyer was willing to develop. She told him to develop it. She drove back to Dodd Creek from the Capitol on a July evening with the legal conversation in her notebook and March in the south pasture ahead and the breeding records in the files at home and the 4 external operations quarterly letters in the drawer and the 8 years of daily entries in 7 volumes on the shelf. And she thought about what Devereaux had asked, which was whether she understood what she was building, and about her answer, which was that she understood what she was documenting. Both things were true, and neither was the complete picture, because what she was building was the documentation, and the documentation was what the building was made of, the two things not separate but the same thing looked at from different directions, the way the south pasture and the north pasture were the same land looked at from different ends of the breeding program, one showing you what the trait became when you selected for it, and one showing you what cattle were before you understood there was something to select for. She pulled into the Dodd Creek bottomland at dusk and put the horse in the paddock and walked to the south pasture fence and stood there in the last light. March was visible at the far end of the field, 11 years old now, moving through the summer grass with the quality she had first seen when he was 3 months old and that she had named in the notebook with the care she gave to naming things she was certain of, which was slowly and precisely and only once, because the right name said everything and you did not need to say it again. The south pasture herd was settled in the evening quiet, the calves of the current year close to their mothers, the second and third generation animals moving with the ease of creatures that had been bred for generations toward a specific relationship with the humans who worked with them. Not domesticated in the diminished sense of the word, but cooperative in the complete sense, the sense in which cooperation is the result of understanding on both sides, the human's understanding of what the animal carried, and the animal's response to being understood. She stood at the fence until the light was gone. She went inside and opened the 8th volume to tomorrow's entry page and wrote the date at the top and left the page blank for the morning, because the morning's observations were not available yet, and she did not write what she had not yet seen. That was the discipline, and the discipline was the program, and the program was the 8 volumes, and the 4 operations files, and the lawyer in the capital, and the buyers from 3 counties, and the Greer arrangement, and everything that had followed from the night she had brought a 41-pound calf home in the bed of a wagon and decided that close to not surviving was not the same thing as not surviving, and that the difference between those two things was worth a night in the barn and a notebook entry and whatever came after that, which had turned out to be 8 years and 4 operations and a body of knowledge that had no name yet, but that was, every morning, in the south pasture, expressing itself in the daily, visible, unmistakable way of something built correctly over a long enough time that it had become the kind of thing that people drove 3 counties to see and then went home and wrote letters about, which was the only measure of a thing's value that she had ever found reliable, which was whether it traveled on its own, carried by people who had seen it and understood it and needed other people to understand it too.